So I think we can start now. I'll introduce you formally first, if that's okay. So, first of all, to all the participants and attendees, good evening. Thank you for being here. And for the attendees, the participants, hope the inquest is like you're having a great time with this researchathon. Uh, my name is Aryan. I'm on behalf of SV90 and Squash Committee. I heartily welcome you all to this informative seminar on unsolved problems in particle physics. Now, I would like to introduce to our guest speaker. First of all, he's an experimental particle physicist. He has done his PhD from Rutgers University and has served as a postdoctoral associate there too. He has previously worked at Atlas Experiment at LHC CERN and also the Collider Detector CDF experiment at Tevatron, which was he was talking about right now. I mean before. He's also a Chamberlain Fellow. I don't know if I spelled that correctly, sir. At Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, LNBL. Currently, he's an associate professor at ISA Pune and a member of CMS collaboration at Large Hadron Collider, CERN Geneva. So it is a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Saurabh Dubey, sir, for delivering this seminar. Now formally, I'd request Dr. Dubey to start, and I'll mute my mic now. So.
Thank you. So thank you for the invitation. Of course, it's always fun to talk about something that from a slightly different perspective than usual. I'm happy to take questions during the talk, after, whenever. Just feel free to interrupt me. In case I don't notice a question, I'll ask somebody to unmute and just tell me. May not be able to monitor the chat box. I have it open, but just in case. In case my voice breaks up or the slides are not seen or whatever, of course, stop me. And then we'll see. Okay, so let's get started. Since the theme of your festival this time is unsolved problems, and since I'm a particle physicist, an experimental one, I thought I'd give a crack at trying to explain unsolved problems in particle physics to you. Okay. So before going on, it's sort of interesting to say what is particle physics. And you can define it in slightly different ways depending on context. But this is a definition that I sort of like. So particle physics concerns itself with answering two questions. What is the universe made of? So that means what are the fundamental constituents of our universe? Fundamental means they cannot be broken up into pieces anymore, right? They are what everything else is made from, the fundamental constituents. And how do these constituents interact with each other? So these are the two questions that particle physics tries to answer. So once we know this, then we can sort of go on and say, okay, so then what would constitute a particle physics problem or not? Now, this is my plan. I'm going to tell you what the standard model is, which is basically the mathematical description that we have of the universe around us. And then I'm going to illustrate a few problems with it. Not all. I thought that I'd explain a few, but in somewhat of reasonable detail. And then I'm also going to explain two hypothetical solutions that we have in mind. I decided to pick two. These are catchy sounding, and you may have heard of them in different contexts. But really, these two solutions are not more or less important than anything else. They're just two that I happen to pick. All right. So on this page 4, I have a diagram and I have a long equation on the right hand side. The left hand side is the periodic table, if you will, of particle physics. Now, just somebody confirm that you can see my mouse. Can you see it?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Yes, sir.
So there is some organization here. Some of you may have seen this before, but it's a little pertinent to us. So let us look at this. The way this picture is divided is on the left hand side, you have things that are matter, fermions. In other words, the world and objects and so on are made up of these things. And on the right hand side, this vertical column here in orange and the Higgs, these are the particles that are used for interaction. So these are your force carriers. Within the stuff that makes up matter, there are two classes. There are quarks up here and leptons down here. And then also another division is a generation wise. So first generation, second generation, third generation. Now, this is basically a summary. These quarks come in particles and antiparticles. Although you see 6 here, there are actually 12 of them. Same thing for leptons, there's 12 of those. In addition, the quarks also come in a different sort of charge, which is called the color charge, or the strong, the charge of the strong interaction. And that comes in 3. Like, electromagnetic charge comes in 2, plus and minus. The color charge comes in 3, red, green, and blue. So there's a factor of 3 there as well. So there's about 6 times 2 times 3. It's about 36 quarks. Then there's gluons and photons and so on. Now, this is a summary of the particle content of our universe. But how these particles precisely talk to each other can be illustrated in various ways. One way to start off everything, if I'm writing a theory, is to start with a Lagrangian density. That is what this right-hand side is. This is the Lagrangian of the Standard Model. It lists out all of the different particles, their mass terms and so on, and all of the different interactions that are possible. As you can see, it's written out in its full glory. It's not particularly pretty to look at, but you can sort of identify blocks within it and simplify writing it down. So what you can do is you can say the Standard Model consists of the strong force and the electroweak force and the electromagnetic force also including, and then the Higgs interaction, and then all of these particles have masses and they come in particle and antiparticle and so on. And so if you write it down in that way, this may look a bit simpler, but I like this version which shows that it's a big, long, complex equation. Now, the good thing about this is that the Standard Model that we have right now is a very, very predictive theory. It makes very, very concrete, precise predictions about certain things. What are some things that you may want to predict? For example, you may want to predict that if I start with, say, a Z boson, how often does it decay? What is its lifetime? Or I may want to talk about what is the mass of the Higgs boson, or what is the mass of the electron, for example. There are various things that I can measure. In addition to these, you also know that we construct composite objects from these particles. So proton consists of 2 up quarks and a down quark. A neutron consists of an up quark and 2 down quarks. So how does a proton or a neutron stay together? What are the forces? If some of you have done a quantum mechanics course, you'll know that you solve the hydrogen atom problem. What do? You start with a proton and an electron, and then you write down the Schrodinger equation, and then you calculate the energy levels, and then you add in maybe a spin term, and then you recalculate the energy levels and so on. You can do this for any sort of a bound state. Similarly, you can do this for a proton. If you know the forces, you have some Lagrangian density, you can calculate this. On page 5, here is a result from it's a summary of a bunch of different results from CMS. The plot is kind of tricky, but let me walk you through it. What this is showing is the x-axis is a bunch of different processes that can take place in nature at a collider. So if you collide 2 protons, you could produce a Z. If you collide 2 protons, you could produce a Higgs. You could produce 3 quarks. You could produce a Higgs with 3 quarks, and so on. So the x-axis lists a bunch of these different processes. The y-axis, in certain units called cross-sections, the y-axis lists how often that process happens. So in some sense, it's like a probability. Of course, it has dimensions. It's not a probability, but it's kind of like a probability. So it allows you to tell that if you collide 2 protons 100 times, what fraction of those are going to be Higgs? What fraction of those are going to be Ws, and so on. So that is what the y-axis is. Now, one of the things to notice is the y-axis is a log scale. It goes from about 10 raised to 5 to 2 times 10 raised to 5 up here, all the way down for this thing to 10 raised to minus 4. So it spans about 9 orders in magnitude, which is pretty large. For each of these processes, we have a theoretical prediction, which is this gray bar that you may see in certain places. For example, here you see a gray bar, here you see a gray bar, and those gray bars exist everywhere. And those gray bars, which is your theoretical calculation based on that Lagrangian, you compare that against what you can go out and experimentally measure. So the experimental measurements are these different square points, the red, the blue, and the green. For most of these, you have the theory and you have the prediction, and they agree with each other quite well within the uncertainty. Now, not only is that a good thing, what is also quite surprising is the fact that this agreement is in something that spans 9 orders of magnitude. So, this is quite a remarkable statement if you think about it. You have a single theory, a single Lagrangian that you can write down and that you can calculate from, that allows you to make predictions over 9 orders of magnitude, right? That is a very strong statement. The reason to spend some time on this, like about 5-6 minutes on this business, is that we are going to go on and talk about problems in the standard model. Now, this is what our theme and what our topic is for today, but it's important to understand that the standard model itself is exceptionally well tested and very robust. This means that before, even saying things like the standard model could be wrong, one has to be very careful. It will be wrong in the sense Newtonian mechanics is wrong. When we introduce relativity, right, it's not that Newtonian mechanics or Newton's laws are wrong. It's just that they need higher order corrections when the speed of a particle is close to speed of light or something like that. Similarly, because the standard model is so well established, so well tested, so well, in agreement with anything that you can observe in nature, whatever problems we have and whatever solutions are still going to have to be minor adjustments to the standard model. This is what we think. Okay. So what is the problem then? So we have, this beautiful agreement across 9 orders of magnitude. We can predict whatever we want under the sun. So why aren't we satisfied? So here is the first thing that I want to get into. Some of you may have seen this. We are talking about galaxy rotation curves. Suppose you take a galaxy, you're astronomically observing some galaxy, and what you try to do is you try to map out the velocity of stars as a function of their distance from the center of the galaxy. So here in the background, there is this galaxy. I place my origin at the center. As you go radially outward, you try to plot what is the velocity, the orbital velocity of the stars that you see. Now, assuming the mass that you see here in terms of this, light, you have some understanding of what the mass to light ratio is, or what the light to mass ratio is. Given so much mass, you see so much light. What you expect to see is this dotted curve that you see here. Now, in multiple experiments over several years, starting from the 1930s, 1940s onwards, many galaxies have been observed. What we see is that the orbital velocity has to increase, and instead of dropping out as you get further and further away from the center, right? Because you're getting further and further away from the mass, which means your g m1 m2 by r square is going down, your speed should go down. What we happen to see is that as far as we can tell, the velocity actually stays flat or increases slightly. So the points show an actual measurement from two different things, from starlight and from observing the Doppler shift in the 21 centimeter hydrogen line. What you see is that this velocity, instead of behaving this way, based on what you think the galaxy looks like, instead looks like this. Now, this is rather strange, and you may have made a mistake, but if you start observing it with different instruments and with different galaxies, you believe that, okay, whatever it is, it's a real effect. So one of the possibilities is that you base this dotted curve on your understanding of what Newtonian mechanics are, Kepler's laws that we learn. That's what this dotted line is based on. But nobody's actually tested Kepler's laws out at the dimensions of a galaxy. So it's quite possible that when you are over very large distances, maybe Kepler's laws don't work. That is a possibility. There is also a different possibility. The different possibility is that although you may think that all of the mass of the galaxy is within the place where you see light, it's quite possible that as you keep going further and further out, there is some other mass that is invisible to you, that you don't see, but that is still there, that is still interacting gravitationally. And that is possibly giving you this sort of an observation, that although you're going further away from the center, the mass that you're accruing inside is not dropping, it just keeps linearly increasing. This is the birth of the idea that there is something called dark matter in our universe. Now, because we had these two possibilities, you could have modified the dynamics, modified Newton's laws, or you could have dark matter. We weren't really sure. Both of the ideas were around for a while. Even dark matter was not immediately accepted by people. There is a second sort of thing that you can look at. So the second idea is based on gravitational lensing. So what is the idea? Imagine that we are an Earth, or this is our Chandra satellite. We are sitting out here, and there is a star a certain distance away. This is a source. As the light from the star goes out in every direction in space, it goes out in this direction as well. Between the satellite, and the source, or between us and the source, imagine that there is a pretty massive galaxy sitting there. What this big large amount of mass is going to do is it's going to cause these light rays to bend. Of course, not as dramatically as shown here at right angles, but nevertheless, the light is going to bend. It's going to bend from this side and it's going to bend from the other side as well. Now, if you're sitting here, what we will see is that we'll see these straight lines, we'll extrapolate it back. We'll see a star in the sky over here, we'll see a star here and here and here and so on. This is an example of where this intermediate galaxy has acted like a lens, and it has caused this light to sort of come back and be focused. When we go out and we observe this, what we actually see is artifacts in our images like this. So you see these smears that we see here, these arcs. So all of those arcs come about by intermediate massive objects doing lensing. The good thing about astronomy is that we have lots and lots and lots of examples. You may have seen this Hubble Space Telescope deep field view thing, where you point it at an empty part of the sky, and as you zoom in, you turn out that empty part of the sky has millions of galaxies. So there's a lot of data. We have seen this sort of lensing behavior time and time again, from micro lensing from just small black holes or whatever to actual gravitational lensing from large galaxies. Now, remember that this lensing that is happening, this bending of light happens because of the mass of the galaxy. So if you're able to know how much bending there is, if you're able to measure things about what sort of lensing effect you're seeing, you can get an idea of the intermediate mass that you have. These sort of gravitational lensing things also lead us to believe that the amount of mass in a galaxy is much, much more than what we can see in terms of the light. Okay, so we have two things. We have galaxy rotation curves and we have gravitational lensing. Both of these point towards the fact that the actual amount of mass in a galaxy is a lot more than just the stars that I see in it, the visible stars that I see in it. So this brings us to the first problem. Now, aside from these simplistic things, we've also gone ahead and done very, very detailed surveys. So the right-hand side picture comes from a satellite called the WMAP, which is the Wilkinson Microwave Anisotropy Probe. The idea behind this WMAP was that you map out the whole sky and you map out the density of this Big Bang microwave background that is all around us, and fluctuations in that density allow you to estimate roughly the total mass and energy content of the universe. From there, what we have seen is that most of the energy content of the universe, about 72%, is in terms of dark energy, which we have no idea what it is. Let's not even go there. But about a quarter of it, 24%, is in terms of dark matter. And the stuff that we are observing is less than 5%. Now, what are the properties we know that this dark matter has? We know that it must have mass, so it interacts gravitationally, right? That's the very least, because otherwise we would not see it in gravitational rotation or in the gravitational lensing and so on. So it has gravitational interactions, it has mass. We also know that this dark matter can't interact via the electromagnetic force or via the strong force, because if it did, we would have seen signs of that. We would have seen either light come from it or other particles come from it. It would not be dark anymore. The fact that it is dark tells you that it's not actually interacting via anything else. One popular explanation for what these dark matter, or not explanation, one sort of paradigm in which to classify this is called WIMPs. WIMPs means weakly interacting massive particles. So weakly interacting means does not interact electromagnetically or via the strong force, but interacts via the weak force. So that's why it's called weakly interacting. The weak force is very, very weak. So because it's weakly interacting, you wouldn't expect to see any light or anything else from it. It's very weakly interacting, like neutrinos are. Now, remember that aside from this, there are also other suggested astrophysical solutions. Like, could this dark matter just be a bunch of small black holes? That has been ruled out. It's still possible that they could be really faint red dwarfs, or they could be massive compact objects of a different kind. So there are various possible solutions. But in terms of particle physics, right, since we know that 24% of our universe is dark matter, the problem is what is the particle nature of dark matter? So if dark matter is made up of some particles, what are these particles? Because our standard model does not have them. So it must be some particle not described by the standard model, and we would like to know what that is. So this is the first problem that we're going to say that the standard model has. It has no explanation for the particle nature of dark matter. All right. This is one. Now we're going to go on to something else. Also around the time of, maybe 50s or so on, 1950s, we had started to build and understand neutrino detectors. So when the first of these neutrino detectors were built, the biggest source of neutrinos in our neighborhood is the sun. In the interaction, the nuclear fusion that takes place inside the sun, you release a lot of neutrinos. These neutrinos stream out in every which direction and they come towards the earth as well. Neutrinos are very weakly interacting. This means that out of every trillion neutrinos, you will get like a few interacting with material. And that also the material has to be very, very dense. So detecting them is not easy. Nevertheless, if you build large enough detectors and fill them with like something like heavy water, so heavy water means it has a lot of nucleons in it. It's more deuterium and tritium rather than just your regular water, the H, the hydrogen atoms. So you build these large neutrino detectors and you sit and you decide to measure what is the flux of neutrinos that is coming from the sun. You know the rate at which the sun is producing energy, right? So that means that since you understand nuclear fusion, you're able to calculate, well, how many neutrinos there should be. So you have a prediction for the neutrino flux, how many there should be. You can sit and measure it. It turned out that in the first experiments, this observed flux was about 1/3 of what was expected. At some later points in some different experiments, it was about half of what was expected. There are also experiments actually in India in the Kolar gold mines, which was also a neutrino experiment. They also observed this, that the observed neutrinos coming from the sun seem to be a lot less, a factor of 2 or a factor of 3 less than what you expected. This was the solar neutrino puzzle. Now this is rather weird. There could be various reasons for this. At that point, very quickly somebody had predicted one sort of an answer, which I'm going to show you on the next page. But it's also important to remember that people also started by questioning our understanding of the sun. There's no reason to assume that you completely understand everything that is happening inside the sun. So people thought, well, okay, maybe the solar model, our model of describing what is happening in the sun, is not correct. As it turned out that we could do a lot of other measurements of the sun in terms of its magnetic fields, in general, its energy output in different wavelengths and so on. That made us nail down the fact that no, the solar model that we think is actually pretty accurate. At one point, somebody had even suggested that, well, the fusion inside the sun had turned off. It's just going to take us a long time for us to figure that out. But thankfully, that was not the answer. So the answer was that these neutrinos, they oscillate. So what does oscillation mean? Well, the sun only produces electron neutrinos. So you're sitting on the earth and you're trying to observe electron neutrinos, and you see that you're seeing a lot less than there should be. It turns out that there are 3 flavors of neutrinos, and the electron neutrinos that are produced in the sun, by the time they reach the earth, they change their flavor. Some electron neutrinos turn into muon neutrinos, some electron neutrinos turn into tau neutrinos, and so on. So when I'm sitting here on the earth and trying to observe or trying to count the number of electron neutrinos, obviously I got a smaller number, right? Because I'm only counting electron neutrinos. I don't see them because they've turned into something else, and I am unable to detect what that something else is. My detector is designed only for electron neutrinos. So once we had this idea, we set out to prove it. You can build appropriate detectors now to measure the amount of muon neutrinos as well, and the tau neutrinos and so on. Now we are able to answer the solar neutrino puzzle. We know that, okay, it's because neutrinos oscillate. It's because they don't have a fixed flavor. They don't if they start off as an electron neutrino, sometime later they will turn into a muon neutrino, and sometime later they'll turn back into an electron neutrino, and so on. So they oscillate between flavors. The problem with this is these neutrinos in the standard model are assumed to be massless particles, massless, moving at the speed of light. If the neutrinos oscillate, and now we know that the neutrinos do oscillate, oscillate means they change flavor, they change from electron to muon, muon to electron, electron to muon, and so on. If they oscillate in flavor, this implies that the neutrinos can't all have zero mass. At least two out of the three neutrinos need to have a non-zero mass, a mass that is different from zero and different from each other. In fact, what is the most likely scenario right now is that all three of them have some minuscule mass. None of them is mass zero. So this is what we have. If among you somebody has done like quantum mechanics or slightly advanced quantum mechanics, one way to phrase this is that the mass and flavor eigenstates are not simultaneous. You can't have simultaneously an eigenstate of both the flavor and mass operators. Anyway, beside the point, the problem with the standard model was that it assumed that the neutrinos are massless, and all of that big Lagrangian that I showed you assumed neutrinos don't have mass. But we have found that that is not true. Neutrinos do have mass. So here is another problem with the standard model. Here it's another unsolved problem. What is the mechanism by which neutrinos get mass? Okay, so this is the second problem that we have. All right. So the first problem was dark matter. We don't know what the particle content of dark matter is. The second one is how do neutrinos get their mass? The standard model says nothing. Now I'm going to go on to a third problem, which then I'll try to solve differently. But before that, I want to just also give you a flavor of the numbers. The right-hand side is a cartoon where the area of a particular particle is meant to represent its mass. So if you see, the top quark is this pinkish large blob here, very, very massive, 172,000 MeV. The charm is this white circle. The up quark is this tiny black dot, if some of you can even see it. It's very, very small. That's about 2 MeV. And in comparison, this is the carbon atom. Now, just remember one thing to keep in mind is that although I have drawn it as an area, each fundamental particle is a point particle. It occupies no size in space. So it's not like the top has a larger size than the up quark. Each of them is a point particle. It's just that their masses are wildly, wildly different. The top quark is about 172,000 MeV. The Z boson is 91,000 MeV. As you come down, you come into particles that have 105 or 2 MeV. Electron is half an MeV. And at the very end, the electron neutrino, at the moment, we think it is this super small 7 to the minus whatever MeV. Very, very light. This hierarchy that you have in masses, this range of masses, is spectacularly dramatic. Each of them is a fundamental particle. They all have the same charge, 1 by 3 or 2 by 3 or something. They interact via the same forces. So each of them does the same thing. So it is very, very remarkable to observe this mass hierarchy. I mean, the example that I read somewhere and that I liked and that I like to give is, suppose you were an anthropologist and you went to the Fiji Islands, all these islands in the, what is it called? Next to Indonesia, in the Zealandia continent. If you went to these Fiji Islands and, Polynesian tribes live there and you found a deserted island where there is some humanity living, you get introduced to a family there. And the family has a son whose weight is about, 40, 45 kilos. There's an uncle whose weight is about, 2 tons. And they have a next door neighbor whose weight is like, 5,000 tons. And each of them is a human. You'd be out of your mind. You'd be like, this can't be happening. They can't be the same species, right? There has to be some explanation. This is why this mass hierarchy bothers us. Such a wide spread of masses without any understanding for it is certainly something that bugs us. It is a problem. This lack of prediction for why this mass hierarchy exists, these all being free parameters in the standard model. So free parameter means you don't have an ability to predict it. You have to go out and measure it. That's a problem. So this is something that bugs us. But let us come to something that is related to here. And this is a neat little problem that I have some equations. So you'll have to bear with me. But if you understand it, the solutions are going to be very rewarding. So we'll make sure we spend time on this, and please, stop me if you don't follow. When we have a theory to calculate the Higgs mass, what we know is that the Higgs mass, it gets corrections to its mass from every particle that it interacts with. Okay? These corrections are proportional to the mass of whichever particle it's interacting with. We know that the Higgs interacts with all of the particles that have mass. So the equation that we write is going to be that the observed Higgs boson mass, the mass that you observe of that particle, Its formula is something like following. It has some bare mass term, just some fundamental term, plus these corrections. All of the boson corrections have a positive sign. So there will be one correction because of the W particle that is proportional to the W mass. There'll be another correction because of the interaction with the Z, which is proportional to the Z mass. Another one for the gluon, and the gluons don't have mass, and so on. There are also fermion corrections which come in with a negative sign. So these fermion corrections are, the top quark and the bottom quark and the electron and the muon and so on. So all of those are fermions. So there's a bare mass term, there'll be some positive corrections and there'll be some negative corrections. And such that after you solve all of these, you have to put in all of the corrections. On the left hand side, you get the right answer. Okay, so this is the way the Higgs mass is done. It has quantum corrections from every particle it interacts with. Any particle it interacts with generates a correction. These corrections have opposite sign, whether it's a fermion or a boson. Okay, so fermions come in with a negative sign, bosons come in with a positive sign. They have opposite signs. All right. So far so good. Now, here's the other thing. These corrections are going to come from also all of the particles that we may not have discovered so far. So we have discovered some set of particles, but of course there could be undiscovered particles, right? I mean, there's no reason to assume we've discovered everything that there is. So those unknown particles could also potentially interact with the Higgs. Now, we don't know what their masses are, so we cannot calculate these terms, correct? Because we haven't found them yet. But this observed Higgs boson mass is what we have observed. That we already know. So the left-hand side of the equation is known. The right-hand side we may or may not know. Now, so these corrections are also going to come from all particles that we may not have discovered so far. Remember that these particles that are undiscovered can have very, very large masses. This means that these corrections, which are proportional to the mass, can be very, very large corrections. Okay so far? All right. Now let's take a slide aside. I want you guys to try this out in your head. Imagine that you take two n-digit numbers at random. So where n is, 2-digit number or a 3-digit number or a 10-digit number or something. Suppose you take two 2-digit numbers at random. You ask one friend for a 2-digit number, another friend for a 2-digit number at random. You subtract the smaller one from the larger one. How many digits does the answer typically have? It turns out that typically the answer also has n digits. If I subtract two 2-digit numbers, most likely the answer is 2 digits, occasionally 1 digit. If I subtract two 4-digit numbers, most likely the answer is 4 digits or sometimes 3. But it's very rare for it to have 1 digit. How do I motivate this? Suppose right now, randomly I ask in the chat box for people to write down two 9-digit numbers. It's unlikely that two people at random will write down numbers that are different from each other by only say 2, right? Most likely they'll randomly pick numbers. And if I subtract them, the answer is also going to be large. Is this idea clear? Some of you can write in the chat box if it's understood, because our argument is going to hinge on this.
Yes, sir. I think
Okay.
right.
Good. So I also did some, I threw some random numbers and I have some example on the left hand side just to illustrate the point. So now here is the problem. The observed Higgs mass, this gets corrections from all the particles it interacts with. These different particles can have different masses. These corrections can also come from particles that we have not discovered so far that can have very, very large masses. In other words, these corrections could be pretty large. So what we are seeing is that this observed MH is a small number, 125 GeV, but these corrections can be very, very large. They can be arbitrarily large depending on the undiscovered particles that we have so far. Somehow, these large corrections that you have on the right-hand side need to be cancelling each other such that you're getting a small number on the left-hand side. So this is called as the hierarchy problem. Why is the Higgs mass at the GeV scale? Why isn't it at some much larger number? Because the corrections to it are very, very large. So this is one of the driving forces behind people doing theoretical research, trying to address this hierarchy problem. Now, honestly speaking, how much of a problem is it really? I like to use this analogy when I come to the hierarchy problem. Imagine that you walked into a room that has a table on it, and on that table there is a pencil that is balancing on its point. Right? So you walked into the room, you see a pencil that is standing like this. Now, is it possible that a pencil can be balanced on its point? Yes, it's possible.
Yes.
Is it likely? No, it's very, very, very unlikely. The smallest perturbation is going to tip it over, right? So when you open the door, you come to this table and you see a pencil standing on its head, you expect the following things. Either the pencil is going to, it's standing right now, but it's going to topple over at any second. So if you stop and look at it for a minute, it's just going to keel over. Or there is some invisible unknown mechanism that is keeping the pencil on its point. Either it's tied by a string or it's glued to the table or something, right? You don't expect that, well, okay, it can happen, so that's what's happening. You think that there could be something deeper behind it. This is precisely the argument that we have about the Higgs mass. Can these large numbers magically cancel to give you a small number? Well, yes, they can, but it's just completely unlikely that that is what is happening. It's much more likely that there is some unknown mechanism that is doing this, and that is a problem. We would like to know what this unknown mechanism is. Okay, so here are my unsolved problems. I've mentioned 3. What is the particle nature of dark matter? We don't know that. 24% of our universe is made of dark matter. We would like to know that. What is the mechanism for neutrino masses? Why do they have mass? How do they get their mass? Why is their mass so small, for example? And then there is the hierarchy problem. Why is the Higgs mass so small? Why are these large corrections magically cancelling each other to give us a small number? Now, aside from these, there are also other things that I did not really describe here, because I wanted to keep it short. There is the amount of matter-antimatter asymmetry that we observe in our universe, right? Everywhere we see there's only matter, there's no antimatter. What is the quantum theory of gravity and gravitons? We have not discovered them. We have no idea what gravitons are and so on. These are also potentially problems in the standard model. Okay, so these are the problems so far. Are there any proposed solutions? Well, it turns out that there are too many solutions. So on the left is a nice little cartoon that Professor Murayama made a long time ago, 12, 13 years ago, so maybe slightly outdated, where on his whiteboard, he tried to sketch out different proposed ideas for, beyond standard model theories. There's quantum dimensions and hidden dimensions and, little Higgses and grand unification and blah, 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 blah. So now I'm going to invoke the fact that I'm an experimentalist and you invited an experimentalist. So what is my problem? The issue is that there are too many proposed solutions. So which one is correct? To understand what I mean by this, I want to take an analogy. Imagine that I have a teacup that is sitting on my table, okay? And I want to ask the question, why does my cup of tea cool? It's hot to begin with. After some point, it cools. I can have different hypotheses, right? I can have different theories or models about why the teacup cools. One of my ideas could be that there exist invisible tea angels who sit on the cup and who blow cold air on it, and that's why it cools. A perfectly valid theory. Or I could say that, well, it cools because the room temperature is less than the tea temperature. Because this room is colder than the tea, that's why the tea cools. Or I could say that, cooling down is an inbuilt property of tea. So whenever there is any tea in the universe, that tea is spontaneously going to cool. That's just an inbuilt property of tea. Or the fourth thing is, I have some Frozone-like qualities. I'm very cool, so the tea cools, right? Each of these is a perfectly valid theory. This is precisely the problem that we have here. There are too many solutions with no idea of being able to tell what is the right solution. Now, can I ask here, how would you find out what is the right solution? I mean, of course, I know that you know the right answer. That's not the question. The question is, how do you find out? You do some experiments, right? You go out and test things.
Testing is only way.
So you decide to, ask a bunch of questions. Okay, if you have tea angels, are these angels corporal? In other words, do they have a body? Can I sense their presence somehow? Do they make sounds? Do they talk to each other? Can I measure the sounds? Are there angels that are associated with coffee? What about if I put this in some different room, right? You're saying that it cools because room temperature is less than tea temperature. What if I put it in some other room? What if I put it in a room that is actually hotter than the tea? Will it cool down then? Can I start with a cool tea, right, and put it in a hot room? What about coffee? If this is an inbuilt property of tea, that cups of tea cool down, what about cups of coffee or cups of milk, cups of whiskey, whatever? What about, if I'm the cool guy and my tea cools, so what about my friend's tea or my boss's tea, right? My friends could be cool because I'm cool, but my boss need not be. So do their tea cools also? So I take these hypotheses, and from these hypotheses, I extract a bunch of questions. These questions I can answer with experiment, right? This chain of logic is something that is very important, and it's really important for you to understand for any science. The hypotheses or models, when we test them, what we are actually testing is the implications of the model, right? Each model implies something. If I take, item number 3, that it's an inbuilt property of tea that it has to cool, this implies that, well, if I had coffee, would it cool? If I had milk, would it cool? And so on. If I take item 4, that it cools because I'm cool, well, what about my friend and so on? So each of these theories has certain implications. By systematically attacking those implications, you can test whether this solution is actually the right solution or not. Now, a subtle thing that you may not appreciate, but I can just tell you, is also that you're never going to be able to prove that something is the right solution. You can always prove that something is the wrong solution. And as you keep eliminating solutions, eventually one solution keeps standing out every time. And you sort of agree that, okay, looks like this is the right solution. All right. So this is our idea. We're going to use this idea for the various number of solutions that we have. Okay. So now this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to explain a couple of solutions. The analogy we have is that we have large experiments. There are various kinds of experiments. I just picked 3 pictures here. So the top right is Tevatron, from which the main title page image came from inside this ring. That was a anti-proton collider. So it collided matter-antimatter. And despite what angels and demons would have you believe, antimatter is really not such a problem. We've had it for a very, very long time. Then there is the SLAC electron-positron collider. That is also a matter-antimatter collider. The SLAC stands for the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. So this is a linear collider. This is circular. The LHC is also circular. The LHC is a proton-proton collider. No antimatter in the collision here. Of course, you produce antimatter from the collisions, so not a problem. So what we do is, with these experiments, we collect a large amount of this collision data, and then we sift through this data to see the signs of whatever your proposed solutions are, to try to decide which one is the right solution, which one is not. That is the mechanism by which we do things. Okay, enough said. Let us now try to see a couple of different solutions. Okay, so I'm going to take you through 2 solutions and what their possible signatures at a collider could be, like what their implication at a collider is going to be. This is what I'll try to tell you. Okay, so the first proposed solution that I want to talk about is called supersymmetry. So this has been around for a long time, originally proposed by West and Zumino, and then a lot of people have worked on this. So at this point, it's very robust, mathematically speaking, from the 40s and 50s, I think. Not 40s, or 60s, roughly 60s, and then 70s is when supersymmetry was first written down. What it proposes is, it is a proposed symmetry between fermions and bosons. Practically what it says is that for every particle in the standard model, there is a supersymmetric partner that differs by half a unit of spin, but all other quantum numbers are the same. Mass, charge, blah, blah, blah. Everything else is the same. Lepton numbers, everything is the same. Only spin is different. So if you start with a spin half particle, you get spin 0. If you start with a spin 1 particle, you get a spin half particle, and so on. This means that in the standard model, every fermion has now a bosonic superpartner, and every boson has a fermionic superpartner. Okay, that's what supersymmetry is. It's a symmetry between fermions and bosons. Aha! Now here is one possible idea. Remember, in the Higgs mass equation, we had the bare mass, and then we had corrections plus for bosons and minus for fermions. And these corrections were mass dependent, for these things. Now our argument is, in these corrections, because each boson correction has a fermion correction with the opposite sign, right? We have now said that every fermion has a boson partner and every boson has a fermion partner. So each of these corrections has an appropriate correction of the opposite sign. And then it is no wonder that these corrections magically cancel each other out. It's not magic. It's just that one is plus, one is minus. And so they cancel each other out. Fantastic. So that means that we don't have to worry about these large scale corrections giving us a small mass. These corrections are meant to cancel each other out. Thus, there is no real hierarchy problem. So these large numbers don't cancel magically, but rather supersymmetrically. That is the argument. That is how supersymmetry solves the hierarchy problem. Now, on the right hand side, I just wrote down some names. So for every particle, there is a sparticle, a supersymmetric particle. And these names are done by adding an S before the name of the standard model fermion. So electron becomes electron, tau becomes tau, top becomes top. In case you start with a boson, then what you do is you add an ino at the end. So photon becomes photino, Higgs becomes Higgsino, and so on. You also define a new number that is called as R parity. It's not important what the formula is. What is important to understand that regular standard model particles have this number equal to 1, and supersymmetric particles or sparticles have this number equal to -1. Why is this relevant? Well, it turns out that this is an additional benefit of supersymmetry. This R parity that we have defined, we could sort of say that, well, it's possible that this R parity is a conserved quantum number. The way, for example, mass is conserved. Mass is not actually conserved. Spin is conserved. Charge is conserved. Electron number is conserved. So in that way, we could have R parity being conserved. If this R parity is conserved, it turns out that the lightest supersymmetric particle, the one that is the lightest one, it can't decay any further. It becomes stable. This is the same argument as to why the electron is stable. The electron is stable because it cannot decay to anything lighter than it that still has charge. So if you have to conserve charge, the electron's daughters, if it decayed, would have to have charge. But since there is nothing lighter than an electron that has charge, the electron is stable. In the same way, there would be nothing lighter than this lightest particle that still has appropriate R parity, so it's conserved, and so it would be stable. The fun part about this is, in certain supersymmetric scenarios, this lightest supersymmetric particle is now stable. It's perhaps weakly interacting, and it is a massive particle. It becomes a prime candidate to be a dark matter particle. So the supersymmetry in sort of, one stone hit two birds. It solved a hierarchy problem, and it gave you a potential dark matter candidate. So if you notice on the right hand side, I have sort of written this thing called a neutralino. So that in many models of supersymmetric, that happens to be the lightest supersymmetric particle, or the LSP, and that is a dark matter candidate. Okay, good. So this seems like a nice solution. It's solving two things at the same time. So certainly two things that I mentioned. So that's a good sign. How would one go about looking for this supersymmetry? Well, we've just doubled the number of particles in the universe, right? So that's why experimentals also love this theory. Instead of just the particles in the standard model, now you have copies of all of those. So you have a lot more particles to discover. You can actually look for evidence of any one of these being produced in the experiment. So the typical experimental searches are going to look for stops and bottoms and gluinos and charginos and neutralinos and charged Higgses and all these different sorts of things. So those are the signs of supersymmetry. Okay, this is one solution. Now let us try a different solution. Okay, here is a nice little different idea. So forget about supersymmetry. Okay, so that was one class. Let's forget about that. Let's come back to the Higgs problem. What was the problem? We said that the observed Higgs mass gets these corrections from very all sorts of different particles, also unknown particles. We don't know them, but of course there's going to be some correction term. We don't know what that correction term is. If these unknown particles are pretty large in mass, then these corrections are going to be large. So that was what we were worried about. We can question this. We can say, well, why exactly do you think that these unknown particles could be large in mass? At the moment, we have discovered the heaviest fundamental particle that we know is the top quark. That is 172 GeV, or 175, whatever. 175 GeV. And why do we think that there could be more massive particles? Why do we think that at higher masses and higher masses we could test? It turns out what we think, and this is very hand-wavy, right? There's no reason for this. It's mostly philosophy. On the left bottom here, I have written down some equation. If I take the fundamental constants, h bar, c, and g, which is the gravitational constant, I can also throw in the Boltzmann constant if I want, and I put them together dimensionally to get a mass scale. right? So if I make this thing, it's under root of h bar c by g, I get some 10 raised to 19 GeV. I can put these together to also get some sort of units of length. So I call that a Planck length and so on. And to these numbers, I associate some interesting or prejudiced quantities. I feel that the Planck length is basically the smallest possible length. The Planck time is the smallest possible time. And the Planck mass is the highest possible mass. Now, I have no reason to suppose this, but I sort of think that, okay, something special going on here. So at the very least, what I expect is that if this Planck scale is the ultimate scale, the highest energy scale, in principle, I should be able to find particles all the way up to the Planck scale. Now, this is not a very strange notion. If you think historically, we started off with things like, just the electron and so on. As we collided particles at a higher energy, we discovered the muon and the tau, which are more massive. We discovered the bottom quark. We went more massive, we discovered the W and the Z. We went more massive, discovered the Higgs and the top and so on. So we expect that as we keep going higher and higher in energy, we may keep discovering more and more particles. And we will do this up until the Planck scale. In other words, these corrections, which are proportional to mass, are going to be large 10 raised to 19, so 19 digit numbers, right? Very, very large corrections. So the argument is, since the Planck scale is so large, that's why these new particles are large in mass. And so that gives rise to the hierarchy problem. But let us question that. In this different solution, we say that, well, what if the Planck scale was not large? So I stare at this formula that I have for the Planck scale, and I wonder, what exactly about this formula? One possibility, as I know the other particle physics also, is that the fact that the G number that comes in here, the gravitational constant, is actually a really, really small number. So because this number is small, this 10 raised to 19 is a large number. Now, why do I think that also G is small unnecessarily? I compare kind of the strength of the electromagnetic force and the strong force and the weak force and so on. Gravity is about 10 raised to 40 times weaker than the electromagnetic force. It's really, really weak. So if I had two protons, then their electrical repulsion is 10 raised to 40 times larger than their gravitational attraction. This is also a hierarchy. Why is gravity so weak? We don't really know. But what if gravity was not actually weak? So what argument can we make? We make the argument of extra dimensions. So here I'm talking about the model of flat extra dimensions that was first proposed by Arkani Hamed, Dimopoulos, and Wali. This is the idea. We have extra dimensions in our universe. Instead of our 3 regular dimensions, we also have extra dimensions that are hidden to us. Gravity as a force propagates into these extra dimensions. Okay, so the other sort of forces are localized here. Gravity propagates into the extra dimensions. Now, typically when you do calculations of any sort, you're going to integrate over volume, right? Typically, if you do force or whatever E&M calculations you may have done, there are volume integrals because we live in a volume. So flux lines or whatever, you're integrating over volume. Now, if you are in 3 dimensions, typically your volume element is d3x, right? So you have some integral over d3x. But if you're actually living in n dimensions, then you must integrate over all n dimensions. So if you integrate over the correct volume, right, all n dimensions of it, then you find out that, well, you're properly taking into account gravity. And then gravity is not really so weak anymore. It is just as strong as the other forces. Okay, so the argument is there are extra dimensions. Gravity propagates into these extra dimensions. Once you correctly calculate the strength, now considering all of these extra dimensions, you find out that gravity is not so weak, which means capital G is not so small, which means that the Planck scale is not so large. The Planck scale is not 10 raised to 19, but more like 10 raised to 2 or 10 raised to 3 GeV. Voila. This solves the hierarchy problem, right? Because that means that these unknown particles that I have up here are not 19-digit numbers, but they're more like 2 or 3-digit numbers. So it is not surprising that on the left-hand side, I get a 3-digit number. So this is a different way of solving the hierarchy problem. Okay, interesting proposal that there are extra dimensions in our universe that lead to solving the hierarchy problem. What are signatures of this hierarchy problem? Now, there are several different signatures that one finds in the literature. I want to talk about a very, very dramatic one. Somebody wrote down this extra dimension theory, and then somebody else came along and sort of said that, well, if the Planck scale is actually at 10 raised to 2 or 10 raised to 3 GeV, we already have large colliders like Fermilab and LHC, which are colliding protons at much, much higher than this energy. Now, that means that you're colliding particles at an energy that is larger than the energy at which gravity becomes strong. So, what happens is that this leads to quote unquote strong gravitational effects. And that could mean that we could be producing microscopic black holes at our experiments. So the idea that there are extra dimensions, at least of this kind, flat extra dimensions, leads to the proposal that we could be producing microscopic black holes in our experiments. This means that we can go look for signs of black hole productions at colliders. If we find them, then we know that there are some extra dimensions, and that's another way to check for this. Okay, so those are the two solutions that I wanted to get into. This sort of brings me to the end. I wanted to say this, that I've outlined a few problems. These are still unsolved problems today, right? Anything that I've said in my talk, none of those problems is solved. Solutions are there. There are too many solutions. We have gone out and we have looked for different signs. We've looked for signs of supersymmetry. This left-hand side graph, it doesn't matter what it is, but it's basically searching for various different kinds of supersymmetric particles. On the right-hand side, I forgot. So this pink here is the extra dimension part. But similarly, we are looking for all of these different solutions to see if any of them can be proven to be true. So far, none of these solutions has turned out to be correct. They're to the extent that we've been able to test, they're all wrong. So that's where we are. What I do in my research, so this is a picture of my group. My group is a part of the CMS experiment at LHC. So similarly, there's an ATLAS experiment. We also search for beyond standard model particles. So these particles can explain why neutrinos have mass. They can come about by particles that exist in unified theories and so on. So vector-like leptons or leptoquarks and so on. Here's a link to my webpage. If you really want to go, you can go check out things. The point is this, the hunt for the solution is on. We have been hunting for a long time. We discovered the Higgs in 2012, but from before that and after that, we've been doing this. What I have done is I've given you a flavor of the unsolved problems that exist in particle physics. But of course, I haven't actually told you how we go about checking these solutions. I told you what the manifestations are, but how does one go look for supersymmetric particles, or how does one look for black holes? This is actually a whole other talk, right? That requires me to explain a bunch of other things. So I didn't do that today. Now, so where does this leave us? Well, it turns out that there are a lot of things that we know already that are tested experimentally really, really well. So the standard model. So this is a good sign. But there are also many things that we need to figure out. And this is even better because this means that I get to have a career. And if you are interested in particle physics, you get to have a career because there are lots of things to do. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for this wonderful
questions now.
I request if anyone has any questions, can please go ahead and ask.
Sir, any significant trend or development in the finding in the unsolved problems of particle physics in a recent time, sir?
So one of the ways that we can address some of these things is, suppose, for example, to be honest, right now we know that neutrinos have mass, but we have not even managed to measure the actual mass of the 3 neutrinos. So on the way to finding which solution is correct for why neutrinos have mass, the first step is, of course, to go out and actually measure the mass itself. So we have a lot of experiments that are getting close to that. So once we have a good idea of what the actual mass is, then we shall be able to come closer to trying to answer, okay, why do they have the mass that they do have? Same thing goes for some of these other things as well. There are dark matter experiments. There's lots of things going on. One of the issues is that there is, until you find something, you don't know how close you are. That is the problem. So it's rather difficult to say whether you could be, the next discovery could be around the corner. You just don't know. So until you discover it, you don't know how close you are.
like just some Rowland waves, you just find it.
Correct. Like are there sterile particles or something that else is a dark matter candidate? Um, or is there some reason why there is more matter than antimatter? The amount of what is called a CP violation in the universe. We can measure that as well. So there are things happening, but it's difficult to say how close we are. Of course, once we solve something, then it's no longer an unsolved problem. So then I would not have included it in my talk. But yeah. So for example, before the Higgs was found in 2012, how particles get mass was actually an unsolved problem. So when I was writing my PhD thesis, for example, how do particles get mass? Sure, the Higgs was proposed, but there's no reason to believe it was the right solution, right? There were many other solutions. There is a solution called Technicolor, but now nobody talks about it because, of course, we found the right solution. So that's how it works. Yes, so I see this question that the electron neutrino changes to muon neutrino, muon to tau. Yes, the tau also changes back. So all of them oscillate into each other at different rates. So they all go back and forth.
Sir, there is a new part here, types of particles, anyons. Yeah, I find in a scientific American journal article that there is a new particle called anyons are found.
So good. So what we are talking about are fundamental particles. So things like anions, skyrmions, and so on. These are things that behave in material as if they were particles, but they are not actually fundamental particles. The analogy would be, how all of us study electrons and holes. So
Yes.
holes aren't real particles, right? But you can, in principle, treat holes flowing as that the direction which current flows. In the same
They are
way,
not
that's
a
what
real
anions
particle.
are.
They are not as a real particle.
Correct. So anions are not real particles. They are a physical manifestation that behaves as if it were a particle. So of course, that's why anions are not a particle physics issue. It's more of a condensed matter problem. So then I see this next question, that how is the mass of a neutrino calculated? Different experiments. So for example, there are current neutrino experiments like T2K, which is an experiment in Japan. Or there are experiments like DUNE, which is coming up, the Deep Underground Neutrino Experiment, and so on. So that is where how you go out and measure the mass of a neutrino. You measure its mass from the way it interacts. All right. Light is made up of photons, particles. How does light get large energy to travel such large speed in space without any material particles required? So that's asking it backwards. So in the sense that light has certain energy, because in space there is nothing to change that energy. That is why light can travel at large distances without anything happening to it. So this is what Newton's law says, right? Like that if you start off with some energy, if there's nothing to stop you, you'll just keep going at that energy. That is what light does. The point is that anything that is massless has to travel at speed c. That's the rule of our universe. So the fact that material, like anything that has mass, it is almost impossible to get to speed of light. On the contrary, for light to slow down, it is also very difficult. That doesn't happen. Okay, so the next question is it correct that particle gets mass from the Higgs field? Yes, so all fundamental particles get mass by interacting with the Higgs field. And well, so of course we know that the dark matter has mass, so we don't have to prove that dark matter has mass. We have experimentally proven that dark matter has mass because we see observations. The problem is to figure out or to catch one dark matter particle to check its mass. So at collider experiments, we routinely study and try to use the Higgs also, if the Higgs decays to dark matter particles, by trying to observe it. So yes, so that is also an ongoing project. Like, can we use the Higgs decay to study what mass dark matter has? Not that prove it has mass, we know it has mass, but we want to measure what that mass is. So Gaurav had a follow-up question that says, how does it get such large velocity that it affects even on time? It doesn't get large velocity, it has large velocity. So it doesn't start to get energy. It's never without that energy. That's the point. That when you have a photon, it is always traveling at speed of light. It's not that I start with 0 and then I give it energy to become speed of light. It is always at speed of light. It doesn't have any other option. That's why you should not think of it as you have given something so that it becomes fast. it's a particle, but it's not a particle like an electron or your car, right? It's not that you accelerate it. You can't. It just has that energy, and it always has that energy. Okay, can a neutrino interact weakly with an antineutrino? Yes. So neutrinos interact with antineutrinos in the same way. Neutrino-antineutrino annihilation leads to Z bosons or the Z boson. So yeah, so that is also one way in which we detect them. So of course, neutrinos only interact via the weak interaction. For an electron can annihilate with a positron via the weak interaction or also via the electromagnetic interaction. Okay, I don't want to miss questions, so I'll go back. Okay, so how do we create dark matter particles in the LHC? So this would be part of a different talk. I mean, what a jet is. So in short answer is a jet is a manifestation of a quark or a gluon. It's a collection of particles that travel together. That's what quote unquote a jet is. But why there are jets, and that will need a longer description of how quarks and the strong force behaves. Dark matter particles in principle would be created like any other particle. So if we have enough energy to make it, we should be able to make it. The problem is that once we make it, how do we detect it? And since we can't detect it, we don't even know if we are making it or not. So that's part of how you go about searching for things. Okay, then is there any way we can experimentally confirm the candidate theories of quantum gravity? If not, how far we reached in experimental evidence of these theories? So the problem is that typically there are two big sort of family of theories that try to explain quantum gravity. One is called a string theory. The other is quantum loop gravity. Both of these are very, very far removed from experiment. So that is why we are nowhere near testing any of these. There are certain implications. For example, string theory mostly requires supersymmetry. But supersymmetry does not require string theory. So that means that tomorrow if we find supersymmetry, that can exist without string theory existing. So that is some ways in we can test this. But also one of the valid complaints of something like string theory, complaints against something like string theory, is the fact that it doesn't make experimental predictions. So that is also a problem. So that's why, well, if it doesn't make experimental prediction, then there's no way of testing it out also. So no, we don't assume that extra dimensions should affect only gravity and not other parameters, right? So the point is that you invent something to solve a problem. I can invent a theory of extra dimensions that says that all forces propagate into the extra dimensions and thus all forces are weak. But that is not a phenomena that I'm trying to explain. The point is you design a theory to explain something that you're observing. So what I'm observing is that gravity is weak and other forces are not. That's why I say that gravity propagates into these extra dimensions. There is nothing that stops me from saying other things propagate into them, but that doesn't help me. I want to say something that's helping me getting to my answer. That's the point. Right? No. So you know nobody's storing dark matter. We don't even know what dark matter is. So yeah, nobody's actually storing dark matter anywhere.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, mistakenly.
Antimatter. You meant antimatter. Sorry. Yeah, understood. No. So it vanishes if it is in contact with other matter, but you can keep it confined by ways of magnetic fields and so on. If it doesn't come into contact with regular matter, you can keep it. So experiments such as Tevatron, which collided proton-antiproton, or SLAC, which collides an electron and a positron. What they do is they create a certain number of antiprotons or anti-electrons and keep them till they have enough. Once you accumulate enough, then you go on and collide them. Then after you have finished all that you have accumulated, you have to go back and make some more. Again, you make some more, you keep them till you're accumulating them. Once you accumulate a certain amount, then you go and collide them again. And then you keep doing this. So the way you store it is by means of magnetic fields and so on. You don't keep it in contact with anything. You keep it, in equilibrium, away from stuff, suspended. Okay, so the question is, why does a charged particle create an electric field and why does a mass particle create a gravitational field? At some level, why is a philosophical question, right? Like, why does it do it? Well, because that's how the universe is designed. We know that it does. We know that anything that has charge can create an electric field. We can calculate how much. We know that a particle that has 2 units of charge will have more electric field than 1 unit of charge. Particle that has twice the mass has twice the gravitational field, and all of this. But what makes it possible is not a valid question, right? Like that is an experimental fact. That is what happens. We can ask, how does it happen? How does it work? How does it do something? And that is what writing down the equation means. When we write down our field equation, or even Q1 Q2 by R square, that is our explanation for how it is. All right, so is Z0, or so W is not W0, W has to be plus or minus. So it's Z0 and W plus W minus. Is Z0 or W plus W minus boson detected, produced from neutrino-antineutrino annihilation? Yes. Neutrino-antineutrino is going to give you Z, it won't give you a W. A neutrino with an electron or an antineutrino with an electron will give you a W. And well, yes, it does mean that neutrino-antineutrino are Dirac and not Majorana. The problem is that this is not conclusive. It's not conclusive enough for us to not be able to tell that the neutrino itself is Dirac or Majorana. So the problem is because you can't actually fire 2 neutrino beams at each other. The way you actually do this experiment is you do it in reverse. You start with a Z and see that it decays to a neutrino-antineutrino. So that is fine. That means you observed the process happening. But now what you need to prove that a neutrino and antineutrino is actually different or the same. So for that you would need the Z, the annihilation is not going to work. So what Dirac or Majorana means that the particle is its own antiparticle. So even with Majorana particles, you'll still get annihilation. So just because they annihilate, you can't say that it's Dirac or Majorana. So what actually happens during matter-antimatter annihilation? So matter-antimatter annihilation is very, very big words for saying something like electron-positron meet and you get 2 photons out of it. The amount or the energy that you will get out of those 2 photons is basically the energy of whatever you put in. If I start with 2 electrons, then the total energy is mc square for 2 electrons. So me square, mc square, twice mec square. That's how much energy I'll get at the very least. And then if the electrons are colliding with some higher energy, I'll get a little bit more. So that already we do at colliders. So that is not really a problem. So I'll come back to this axion question. And photon is its own antiparticle. Why do they not annihilate? Well, the answer to that is subtle. The answer is that they quote unquote, well, a photon can't interact with other photons directly because to interact with a photon, you need charge, and a photon has no charge, so it can't interact with itself. But also, if I fire a beam of photon and another beam of a photon, they're going to interact to give me a E plus and a E minus. So the photons will be annihilated. It's just that I will pair produce. I'll produce an electron and a positron. Now to come back to this axion thing, yeah, I also want to know more about axions. I don't actually know enough about axions to answer your question. Why are axions potential candidates for dark matter? I mean, it's a different solution, right? Like you have supersymmetry or external, you have another solution called axions. Sure. I will have to read up more. That's the answer I can give right now. Okay, sorry. So I went a bit quick through a bunch of questions because I did want to get through all of them. If in particular something I have not answered, you can feel free to write again and I'll try to give a slower answer since I see that we've come to the end of most of the questions there. So you can produce antimatter in various different ways. I can tell you what we did at the Tevatron. So where you have to produce antiprotons. The way it was done is that you take protons, you have a target of molybdenum, which has a certain number of protons and some atomic mass number it has. You fire protons at this molybdenum target. It could be any other target, but you fire it at that. And of the stuff that comes out, occasionally an antiproton will come out. They're very, very rare. So it used to be, I forgot the numbers, but it was something like for every 10 raised to 10 protons you fire, you get 1 antiproton or something like that. And so then you take this antiproton and you save it. So that is a way to create antimatter. Same thing with positrons. You can also, fire electrons at something, have a reaction take place and have positrons come out, and then you save them. I mean, they are also going to come about because of decays, but usually the problem is producing the particle that decays. So that's what I'm talking about. You get them from decays, but you need to produce the particle that's then going to decay to give you an antiparticle. Now, I just want to put this out there because sometimes this doesn't come across. Antimatter, there's nothing special about antimatter. Okay, antimatter is just matter. It just has opposite charge. So don't really worry about whether something is matter. And there's nothing special about antimatter. It's just of the opposite charge. That's it. Okay, so this is a good question. What is a sterile neutrino? Anything sterile means it does not take part in any interactions. Okay, so sterile would mean that if it's perfectly sterile, that means it undergoes not even the weak interaction. The problem would be if something is perfectly sterile, then you have no way of interacting with it. You have no way of knowing if it's there or not, because how will you know? It doesn't interact. To know something exists, you have to interact with it somehow, right? So through some force or something has to happen. So a perfectly sterile neutrino is one that has no other interactions. These are sometimes proposed in some models. And then because for various reasons, you can give them small amounts of interactions by mixing the sterile neutrino with the standard model neutrinos that do the weak interaction. And you can control the amount of mixing. So you can control how sterile the sterile neutrino is. You don't want it to be perfectly sterile because then you can't find it. So there's no point to such a theory, right? If I have a theory that there is a genie in my office, but the genie does nothing and interacts with nothing and doesn't talk and nothing, then what's the point of the genie? There's no point in looking for it.
We can't say it's the genie even exists.
Yes, exactly. You can't even say it exists. Correct. Well, that's that. I mean, I wouldn't put it, and that's a fairly strong statement because there are certain things that you can do to prove something was created. The problem is studying it is next to impossible. So there are studies that say, for example, with neutrinos, how many generations there are. You can do this from different studies. But more or less, yes, you're right. If it doesn't interact, then that's as good as it doesn't exist. Like even with dark matter, right? It has to interact gravitationally. If it didn't even interact gravitationally, you would never have found it also. You would not know it existed.
Okay, I think so. Everyone's questions have been answered. So first of all, I would like to thank Saurabh sir for sparing his valuable time and being with us here today to impart us immense knowledge on unsolved problems in experimental physics like the mechanisms of neutrino mass, particle nature of dark matter and hierarchy problem, and also its proposed solutions. I really hope our audience has been greatly benefited by this talk. We would like to present sir with a memento in coming days as a token of humility and gratitude. Secondly, I would like to thank our faculty members who helped us organize this event and our administrative, technical and management team, which so wonderfully executed the entire event. Last but not the least, I would like to thank you guys for being such a wonderful and interactive audience. Thank you very much, sir.
Okay. I had fun. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye.